In this video, we'll be going step by step on how to create this particular epic sci-fi logo intro animation. We'll be using very basic physics simulations and a few nifty tricks here and there. So be sure to watch till the end. And with that, let's begin the tutorial. The first thing that we need to do in our default scene is add in a ground plane for our physics. So we'll press Shift A and search for a mesh plane by coming up here and selecting the plane over here. Then press S 100 to scale it up by 100 units on all of the axes. Then we can select our default cube and press GZ and move it up by like 15 units so that we have it up over there. Next, we can rotate it arbitrarily by pressing R twice to get trackball rotation and just move it to some random rotation. Once you've done that, we need to convert this into physics objects so that they can actually interact with gravity. So let's go to our physics properties over here and choose rigid body. And now when you just play the animation, you should see it fall down. But right now it's falling right through the plane. So we need to get it to actually interact with the plane. For that, we need to convert the plane into a rigid body as well. So let's select the plane, select rigid body and change the type from active to passive so that it does not fall along with gravity. Now when you play the animation, this is what you should get. The cube just falls and takes on this type of a rotation. But I don't want it to just fall and settle down that fast. I want it to actually bounce around a little bit more. So in order to increase the bounciness of it, what we can do is start off by going to the plane rigid body settings, going down to surface response and increasing bounciness up to something like 0.4. Then I'll select the cube and I'll change the shape from convex hull to box and I'll change the bounciness all the way to 1. So now when I go back to frame 0 and play the animation, we should see it actually bounce around a little bit more before it settles down. And I think that looks a lot better. So I'll actually leave it like this itself. And this is the animation that we'll be working with. Now, the next thing is actually settling down how long our animation is going to be. So since I don't want to see it actually start falling and I want it to come into frame while it's falling in fast, I'm actually going to start my animation from frame 20. But if I right now change the start frame to 20, we'll see that there is a possibility of the animation to get reset. So it's best that we actually bake in this particular motion to the keyframes. And to do that, we change the start back to 1. And we go to object, rigid body, bake to keyframe. And we label down what the end frame is going to be. So since I want the start to happen at frame 20, I'm going to leave this start at frame 1 so that it actually considers that while baking in the keyframes. But the end frame is going to be 20 plus 150 so that it's a 5-second long intro. So 20 plus 150 will make it 170. And maybe I want it to be 6 seconds. So I'll change it to 200 and then I'll press OK. Now I can change the start frame to 20. And now you see it's no longer a rigid body, but the entire animation data has been saved as location, rotation, and scale keyframes present down here. So that's exactly what we want, but we also need to change the end frame of our animation to frame 200. So now we have just a 6-second long animation. So the next thing that we have to do is actually make sure that we have rigid body switched off for the plane as well, so that it is a lot faster and we don't have to duplicate it for the next portion, because we want this plane to convert from a rigid body to a collision object for the particles. Let's switch off rigid body, come to frame 20, and at about frame 40, which is when it actually hits the plane. So you can see at frame 41, it's perfectly hitting the plane. We actually want there to be a lot of particles that are emitted from the surface of this cube. So in order to do that, we're going to actually add in a particle system. So let's select the cube, go to the particle settings over here, press this plus button to add in a new particle system, and we'll change the start frame to frame 40 and we'll change the end frame to about when it settles down. So it starts settling down by about frame 82, after which it doesn't bounce, it only slides. So we'll change the end frame to 82. We'll increase the lifetime randomness to 1. And now let's just play the simulation. And you see all these particles just fall straight through the floor. We don't want them to fall straight through the floor. So we select our ground plane, go back to the physics properties, and this time add in a collision modifier. And now we go ahead and increase the stickiness to something like 0.4 and then go ahead and play the animation again. So we see that now the particles are actually bouncing off the plane and that looks pretty good, but I feel like they're bouncing a little too high. So you can see this particle actually bounces up that high. I don't want it to bounce up that high, so I'm going to actually increase the stickiness to 0.8. And now when we play it, that's what it looks like. And I think that looks much cooler. So it hits and there's a lot of particles that are emitted. Now I want the object velocity to also be incorporated into the particles when they fall out. So to incorporate the object velocity, we go to the particle settings with this cube selected, go to the velocity over here, increase object velocity all the way to 1. And now when you play around with it, you should see that the actual object's rotation and everything affects how these particles are emitted. And that just looks a lot cooler in my opinion. So that's nice. And if we're happy with it, we can go ahead and bake these particle settings as well. Let's select the particles, go to cache or cache and choose bake the physics. So once it's baked in, the motion of the particles will no longer change and it'll be perfectly all right. But we need to now make sure that we have these particles not this large, but actually looking like very small, tiny chunks that have been emitted from this particular cube. In order to do that, we have to add in some object for these particles. So press Shift A, search for a mesh icosphere, and we'll just move this icosphere away by pressing G and selecting it and moving it to the side to somewhere that it won't be seen. Let's just move it up. That's definitely out of the camera view. And then we'll select our emitter object, go down to the object, to the render tab over here and select render as object. And for the object, we can go ahead and select icosphere. And now we can play around with the scale. So I'm going to change the scale from 0.05 to 0.008. And I'm going to increase scale randomness all the way to 1. And I think that's good enough. Now we have these tiny particles that hit and they move around, they bounce a bit, and then they all die out. Now that we have that set, we need to go ahead and actually place our camera. So let's select the camera and just move it such that we have the face that we want. So we can actually adjust this to any face after it lands. So we can either have this as the front face or this as the front face. So the camera could be pointed like this, or the camera could be pointed like this. It could technically be this other face as well. It's up to you, but I think I'll just select this particular face for now. So let's press 0 to go into our camera view, tap N to open this side panel, go to view and click camera to view. Then just move your camera around how you would generally move it in any other normal scene and place it till it's absolutely flush with this particular face. You can move it on the local axis by pressing Z twice and just zooming out till you're happy with the positioning. And I think that looks good. Let's just delete the keyframe that was created. And once you're happy with it, you could parent it to an object. But right now, if we actually play the animation a bit, we see that the cube moves away. So it's important that when you place the camera, you make sure that you place it when the cube has finally stopped moving completely. So I think I'm going to have to go to frame 120 and just move my camera around. So I'll press GX twice to move it on the local X axis till it comes out perfectly flush with this cube. So just make sure that your cube looks like it is perfectly in line with the camera. You can tap N and just uncheck and zoom in to make sure that this distance is the same. So right now I feel like this distance is a bit more than this, which means it's not still straight. So let's select the camera, press RZ and just rotate it about the Z axis until they become perfectly flat. And I think that should do the trick. I'm also going to rotate it on the X axis a bit, the local X axis that is, and then move it down on the global Z so that we have this sort of a look. If you want to make sure that this is perfectly centered, go to the camera properties, go to viewport display, increase passport out all the way to 1, switch on composition guides and choose center. That way you can actually position this so that it's perfectly at the center. So clearly it's not. Let's press GX twice and move it to about there. And that makes it perfectly centered. So once you have it approximately at the right place, select the cube and press Shift S and choose cursor to select it. That brings the cursor to the center of the cube. And then you can press Shift A, empty plane axis, and just scale the plane axis up. Then you can go ahead and actually select the camera and move it just to make sure that the center of the plane axis is the center of the scene. So you can line it up with the 3D cursor, and that way you know that you do have it perfectly in the center. Then select the camera, Shift select the empty and press Ctrl P, set parent to object. Now on frame 120, you can go ahead and tap I to add in a location, rotation and scale keyframe, but then you can go back to about frame 20 itself, press S to just scale it out, and then GZ and just rotate it until the cube gets into your view. So scaling up actually zooms out by pushing it back, and then lift it up until you just have the cube in your view. But again, we don't want the cube to be completely in our view. So I'm just going to zoom in till it's just outside our view and then tap I, location, rotation, scale. So now when I play the animation, this is the animation that we have, and we just zoom into the cube like that. So that seems good enough. I actually don't want it to rotate from this point itself. I just want it to remain till about frame 30. So I'll move this to frame 30, and now we have it bump in and we zoom in, and that looks perfectly all right. Now that we have that particular animation set in, we can go ahead and start adding in the actual logo. So you could add in a logo using an image as we did in this particular video, but for today I'll just add in a text. So I'll press Shift A, search for a text object, and I'll label it to whatever I want it to be. So let's type in AI. Now we have AI typed in, but we need to make this flush with this particular face. So let's rotate it on the X-axis by 90 degrees, press 7 to go into the top view, grab it and move it to about there. And we just have to make sure that the origin is perfectly placed over there, and then press RZ and bring it to the side. Now we're not going to centralize it right now because the origin is present at this corner. If we shift everything to the center of the origin, it'll work. So let's go to the alignment and the text properties over here and change this from left to center. And and that way it just comes perfectly centralized. Even vertical will make it middle, and that way we should have AI present right at the center of the cube. Next, we can give this a better font. So let's expand font, choose whatever you want, and that should be all right. Once you're happy with the font and everything, shift select the cube and press Ctrl P, set parent to object. So now we have the AI text also coming in just like that as we zoom in. So that looks perfectly all right. So we can start off with the texturing of all of the different objects in the scene. So for that, we'll start off by setting all of our defaults. Let's go to the render properties, switch on ambient occlusion, bloom, and screen space reflections. Ambient occlusion is very important to be checked because we will be using that in our shader editor later on. Then let's go to our output properties, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second, change the end frame and start frame according to what you want, but we've already set that. Output folder can be wherever you want it to be. File format, we're going to choose FFmpeg video. Encoding, we're going to choose MPEG-4 as the container, and output quality of perceptually lossless. Now we're going to go ahead and start off by giving materials to our default cube. So let's select the cube, bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and change this from the 3D viewport to the shader editor. Then we already have the default material attached to the default cube, so we can directly play around with that. To actually see the changes, we'll switch from a viewport shading of solid to a viewport shading of render. Then we'll press Shift A and search for an ambient occlusion node, and we can take the color and plug it into the base color. And if you actually look at it, we do start seeing some ambient occlusion occurring, but they're occurring towards these bottom edges. So we change this from everything unchecked to inside. So when we check inside, you can clearly see how there's ambient occlusion occurring around these corners and edges, but we need to actually punch these in. So let's press Shift A and search for a color ramp node, plug that in over here, and just bring the black in to actually darken out those edges, and bring the white in to clear out the other borders. That looks good enough. Of course, you can increase the samples to something like 64 to make it much smoother. And now by playing around with the distance, you should be able to get an edge selection for the mask. So that looks good enough, but I also want these edges to be a little bit more prominent. So I'll have to add that in by selecting this ambient occlusion, pressing Shift D, bringing it down here, and this time not checking inside. So if you actually were to plug this into the factor now, you'll see these areas are far more prominently placed. So are these. So I want this to also be present. I'm actually going to increase the distance for this up to maybe 0.8 or 1. And to mix both of these together, I'm going to mix them using a mix RGB node. So press Shift A, search for a mix color, plug that in over here, and just bring the color into the color A and the color B. And I'm going to change this type from mix to multiply and increase the factor all the way to 1. Now we have all of those edges appearing fairly well, and this is what it looks like, but it's far too plain right now. We need it to have some noise also added in. So to add in some noise, we can just mix in some noise as well. Let's select these nodes, move them to the side, select the multiply node, press Shift D, and this time from multiply, we'll change it to add, and we'll bring this in right here. And for slot B, we'll press Shift A and search for a noise texture, and we'll plug the color into B. However, for the actual factor, we're going to use this original ambient occlusion as the factor, and that way we get a blend between the ambient occlusion mask that we created as well as the noise. So that looks great. Let's bring this black in a bit further, bring the white in as well, and I think that looks good enough. So now we can take this and plug it not into the base color but as the emission strength, but we want the areas that are black to be the brightest. So for that, we have to invert the color ramp. We can do that by searching for a math node, switching it from add to subtract, and making it 1 minus the output from the color ramp. So let's make it 1 minus this particular output, and then plugging this into a math node that is changed to multiply so that we can have an emission strength far greater than 1 as well. So let's switch this to multiply, plug this in here, change this second value to something like 100, and then plug this value into the emission strength. Now we can remove this from the base color, and this is what we have. Currently nothing can be seen, and that's because we haven't actually given the emission some color. So let's just give it some color, and you can now see what it looks like. But I obviously feel like the bloom is way too strong. So let's go to the bloom properties in our render properties, expand it, and change the intensity down to 0.02, and we'll also clamp it down at something like 5. So there we have that, but this ambient occlusion edge is a bit too hard. So to change that, I'm going to change the scale of the noise to something like 15, and I'm going to search for a color ramp node before the noise texture reaches the add. I'm just going to crunch these values in to just roughen up the edges. So that looks a bit better, I would say. Again, it's up to your preference and what you think is necessary, but I'm going to leave it like that. I'm also going to just switch off overlay so that we can see it better. And now I'm going to increase the principled BSDF metallic value all the way to 1, and I'm going to reduce the roughness from 0.5 to 0.3. Now if we just play the animation, this is what we have. The cube comes, lands, bounces around, and we get that. So that looks great, but we need there to be nice reflections on the floor as well. So let's select the floor, give it a new material, and for this just increase the metallic all the way to 1. And for the roughness, we'll press Shift A, search for a noise texture, and we'll search for a color ramp so that we have better control. Plug the color into the factor of the color ramp, and plug the output color into the roughness. Then we'll increase the scale up to 100 and we'll increase the detail all the way to 15 and the roughness up to 0.8. Once we're done with that, we'll bring the black in quite a bit and we'll bring the white in quite a bit as well. And that should just have these really nice reflections, which should look much cooler. Now I feel like the cube always remains too close to the floor, so we don't get justice for the reflections, especially as it lands. I'm going to choose the camera and just press GZZ to move it back on the local Z axis so that it's a bit further behind. And now when I play the animation, we should see some more of the actual reflection occurring and all of that, which yeah, looks better in my opinion. Next, we don't need this default light, so let's just hide it or delete it if you don't want it at all. But we need some sort of a background. To add in background elements, you could add in different cubes with the same type of materials and just duplicate them around. I'll probably create one version like that, or you can simply add in a backdrop. So for the back, I'm going to actually just change the background colors itself. So I'll switch from object to world in my shader editor, and here I don't want this lighting to actually affect the lights in the scene, so I can mix and use a different one, but maybe I'll just try and see what happens if it affects the lighting. Let's keep it like this. Press Shift A, search for a noise texture and a wave texture. So press Shift A, wave texture, and this is going to be very similar to what we've done in this video over here. Do check that out if you haven't already, but of course it will be completely different as well. So now let's plug this color into vector and plug this color into the color of the background and just see what we have. So that's all right. Let's go ahead and start reducing the scale down to something like 2, and even on the noise texture, let's just reduce the scale down to about 2, and I actually want the roughness to be down to 0. And for this wave texture also, I'm going to have the roughness down to 0. Maybe I'll increase the wave texture scale to 3, and I'm going to plug all of these through a color ramp. So press Shift A, search for a color ramp, plug that in over here. I'm going to first flip it by making the black on the right hand side and white on the left hand side, and I'm going to bring the black in. Now I'm going to change this from white to that same bluish color, but I'm going to keep it extremely desaturated. And as you can see, that actually makes everything look a little too blue. So I'm actually going to change this also to a dark bluish color, but I'm not going to let this affect the actual scene lights. So I'll press Shift A, search for a mix shader, plug it in over here, take another background node, press Shift D, plug it in here, take this and plug it into the bottom socket, take this and plug it into the top socket. And now I'll press Shift A, search for a light path node, and I'll plug is camera ray into the factor of the mix shader. So that way, if our camera is viewing the scene, it'll see the background, but the rest of the scene receives this particular color. So this one, I don't want it to be this bright. I'm going to reduce the brightness and I'm going to make it this dark bluish color. Apart from that, I don't want this line to just remain as a solid line. So to get it to move, I'm going to play around with the phase offset. So between frame 20 and frame 200, I'm going to change the phase offset by a multiple of 2 pi. So on frame 20, I'll keep the phase offset at 0 and tap I. And then on my last frame, which is frame 200 or maybe 170 itself, I'll change the phase offset to 2 star pi and then tap I, and that'll make it perfectly looping, although we don't need it to be a perfect loop because we are not making a looping animation. So if this is a bit too fast of a motion, you can always change this to linear and change the playback to frame dropping so that you can see the actual speed at which everything is moving. If you think it's moving too fast in the background, you can change it, but I think this is not too fast, so I'll leave it like that itself. So next, we need to play around with the material for the sparks that we created. Let's select the icosphere, change this from world to object, add in a new material, and I just want this to be emissive, so let's select principal BSDF, tap X to delete it, press Shift A, search for an emission node, plug the emission into the surface, change the color to this bluish color, increase the strength to like 100, and now we have particles zooming out as we land. So that should be good enough. Of course, if you want this area to not be this type of a steep cutoff, you can select the plane, move this to the side, press Shift A, search for a mix shader, plug that in over here, press Shift A, search for a transparent BSDF, plug this into the second socket, then press Shift A, search for a gradient texture, and make sure that you have node wrangler enabled. When you press Ctrl T to add in the texture coordinate and mapping nodes, switch this from generated to object so that you get a gradient that goes out from the center. Now we don't want it to be linear, we want it to be spherical, and now you can plug this into the factor of the mix shader, and to actually see the transparency, you're going to have to go to the material settings and change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend. Next, Ctrl Shift click the gradient texture so that you can see what it looks like, and right now the central region is white, and as we go towards the edge it becomes black, which is the opposite of what we want. So I'll press Shift A, search for a color ramp, plug that in right here, and now flip the colors around and change this from linear to ease. Now we can plug this into the factor and Ctrl Shift click the mix shader, press 0, and now you can see we have a little bit of a fade off as we go to the edge. So to increase the fade off, all you do is just bring this slider back and we get more and more of a fade off. Now in case you don't get reflections happening, change this blend mode from alpha blend to alpha hash, and that way you'll get the reflections as well, along with the fade off towards the edges. So with that, the last thing that we have to do is actually animate the AI text that we created. So with that selected, add in a new material. We're going to remove the principled BSDF, press Shift A, search for an emission node, plug that into the surface, and now till about frame 100, we can keep the color at that bluish color itself, but the strength set down to 0, and then tap I. Then by the time we reach about frame 140, we can increase the strength to like 100 and then tap I. So now when you play the animation, you should see the AI slowly come in. And if you want, you can have these edges also reduce in size by animating the distance keyframes over here. So if you actually start reducing the distance, they're going to start moving away to the side. So I'm actually going to do that as well. So till about frame 100, we'll keep the distance at 3.5. So tap I. And then by frame 150, we'll reduce the distance down to 0.2 and then tap I. So now when you play this animation, you have these also moving back. I think that looks cool enough. Now again, it's up to you as to how you want to customize this scene. I'll create maybe another variation and show that as well as inspiration, and you can choose how you wish to do it. So if you're happy with the way this turned out, you can go ahead and press render animation. I really hope you found this one useful and can use the techniques that you learned in this for various applications and animations. You can use SVGs, curves, just text or images in place of whatever logo you want, and this by itself can act as a template to create various versions. Let me know if you want even more of these types of logo animations, and I'll definitely keep creating them. And if you haven't checked out the logo animation playlist on my channel, definitely check that out, because I post a video every single day and I'm sure there's something or the other on my channel that you could get inspiration from to create your own animations. Until the next video comes out tomorrow, thank you so much for watching, keep creating and stay creative.